Hi, my name is Wade Skeen. I served for the last 17 years in the military and was a part of and supported some of the actions with Operation Iraqi Freedom. I've always heard negative things about America being involved in Operation Iraqi Freedom, so I took the chance to do a little research about this speech and come up with my own conclusions as to whether or not we were right or wrong to be involved with that conflict. First off, I want to start out by going back to 1988. In 1988, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons to bomb a city about 150 miles north of Baghdad named Halabja. They killed 5,000 Kurds. This was during the Iranian-Iraqi conflict, and the Kurds sided with the Iranians at that time, and he used those chemical weapons to kill 5,000 of his own people. So that's one thing that started some of the trends that Saddam Hussein kept going throughout the future. Just for an overview on this, we're going to go over whether or not we had the authorization or legal authority from the international community and United States governing bodies to enter Iraq. We're also going to go over why we entered Iraq and went with military option in Iraq. And we're also going to cover the topic of weapons of mass destruction, or more common use term for that is WMDs. So first we'll start out with authorization. Did the U.S. military have authorization? Did President Bush have authorization to send United States military forces into Iraq for an armed conflict? Well, everything I looked up on this, going back to whitehouse.gov and congress.gov, and even some of the other information from the UN, led me to the conclusion that yes, we absolutely did. From a legal standpoint, America had every legal right to begin armed operations against Iraq. In 2002, 49 United Nations countries agreed, which was the majority, agreed that military conflict, military actions needed to be taken against Iraq. We'll go into some of the why they did that here in a little bit. Back here in our own country, our own elected representatives in the Senate and the House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly in support of it as well, to support President Bush's authorization to take up military actions against Iraq. So much so that 82 Democratic senators and House of Representative members actually voted with President Bush on this. One of the more notable ones being presidential hopeful that we have right now, and Hillary Clinton, who was a Democrat from New York, senator at the time. So we talked about the legal authorization. Did we have legal authorization to do it? Yes, we did. We had authorization through the United Nations, the international community, and through our own elected officials as well, with the House of Representatives and the Senate. But why would we invade Iraq? That's a more important question, I think. First off, we go back to 1988, what I was talking about in the attention opening portion of the speech. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons. He committed genocide against the Kurds in his own country. So we know he had weapons of mass destruction. We know he was willing to use those because he did it. The next thing was in 1991, the Iraqi military, which was the 5th or 6th largest military in the world at the time, pretty significant, invaded the tiny nation of Kuwait. This is what most people refer to as the first Gulf War, or Desert Storm, Desert Shield, that type of thing. They invaded Kuwait mostly because of its oil-rich properties there in Kuwait, and there was a larger fear that they were going to then proceed beyond Kuwait into Saudi Arabia for the same reason, for its oil-rich properties as well. The UN authorized the United States to go in at that point in time and get the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, which we did in early 1992. We went in, ran about a 2-month campaign, mostly aerial with some ground forces towards the end, got all the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, back in Iraq, and ran them back a couple hundred miles back in Iraq, and then withdrew. A lot of people criticized President George Bush Sr. for that, for not going in at the time and overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime and the Ba'ath Party then. But going back to our legal aspect, legally that's not what he was authorized to do by the UN. The UN authorized him to get Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. That's what he did. The next thing, from 1992 until 2002, leading up to Operation Iraqi Freedom that started in March of 2003, Saddam Hussein had a never-ending track record of non-compliance with UN inspectors. At the end of the first Gulf War, Desert Storm in 92, the UN put on sanctions for Iraq and also told Iraq that if they wanted to receive any aid, they were going to have to allow UN inspectors to come in and inspect to see if they had any chemical weapons facilities, biological weapons facilities, nuclear weapons facilities, all those type of things. Saddam Hussein had a long-standing track record of not complying with those, whether it be hiding it, moving it, or just not allowing the inspectors in to begin with. President Bill Clinton even went so far as to take up military operations and bombed Iraq on a couple of separate occasions himself, or authorized that himself, because of their non-compliance with that. Those are known as Operation Northern Watch, Operation Southern Watch, all throughout the 90s and early 2000s. So we talked about the why. Why would we want to go into Iraq? Why would we want to take up military operations against Saddam Hussein? Now we're going to talk about the real taboo, the real buzzword to the whole thing. WMDs. WMD stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction. First off, what are WMDs? WMDs are chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, high explosive munitions. CBRNE is what we refer to it in the military that you'll hear a lot of times. WMDs can be any of those things. They're weapons of mass destruction. They are usually deemed a war crime to use those things, except for extreme circumstances. That kind of gives us the breakdown. We know that he had chemical weapons. We know that he was trying to produce biological weapons. And there's even reports out there that he was trying to get the technology and the weaponized nuclear particles to produce nuclear weapons at one point in time too. The Mossad out of Israel gave us that intelligence, and there's even some reports that Israeli fighters went into and bombed some possible nuclear facilities in Iraq in the late 80s, early 90s time frame. So we know what WMDs are. What do we know about WMDs being in Iraq? Why didn't we ever find them? Where were they? Well, it turns out we did find them. We found them for a long time. In a New York Times article in 2014, you can easily find this, Google New York Times article about WMDs in Iraq. Turns out from 2004 to 2011, we found over 5,000 chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, WMDs in Iraq. Even so, there were 6 U.S. military service members across that time span that got injured and suffered injuries and had to be medically attended to because of during the disposal process of these WMDs that, if you listen to some people, never even existed in Iraq. To go beyond that, a Telegraph.uk article written in late 2014 as well kind of gave me my first experience with ISIS. Was reading this article, is the fact that ISIS, when they were first coming about, when they first started taking over Iraq after we pulled out, they actually found a facility which was Saddam's major manufacturing facility for chemical weapons in Iraq, and came across tons of sarin gas, CX gas, and mustard gas in Iraq at this facility in mid-2014. These were all produced during the Saddam era, which didn't happen after 2003 when we invaded the country, and had been stored in this facility that whole time. What does that tell us? Saddam had chemical weapons. Another thing that nobody really brings up is when we said that we were going to invade Iraq, when it became an imminent threat that we were going to invade Iraq, there's a lot of claims out there that Saddam took the chemical weapons out of Iraq and moved them to Syria, which was their closest ally in the region at the time. Surprise, surprise, Syria then used chemical weapons a year ago, 2 years ago, against their own people during an uprising there. So one more thing that links Saddam Hussein to having chemical weapons that whole time. So, I'm going to go back over everything. What I wanted to talk about today was, did we have the legal authorization to go into Iraq? We concluded yes, we absolutely did, between the UN and our own elected representatives. Why we invaded Iraq, how Saddam acted over his time frame while he was in charge of that regime and the Ba'ath Party there, and what he did leading up to it to go along with the UN non-compliance. One of the reasons the UN gave us authorization to go in to begin with. And then we went over the aspect of what are WMDs and were WMDs in Iraq. The conclusion is there were WMDs in Iraq. We found them. The media, through their negligence or through their purposeful misleading, just never reported on it. And if they did, they buried it so far underneath that nobody ever found out about it. So my conclusion is we had every reason to go in Iraq, and we actually accomplished the mission that we went there for. Thanks.